I'm a 32-year-old woman, married to my husband Daniel, who is 34. We've been married for 2 years, and just recently bought our first home together. It was supposed to be an exciting fresh start, a place we could finally make our own after years of saving and planning. But from the very first weekend after we moved in, his mother Margaret became a constant presence. She is very traditional, the kind of person who believes that a household should look and function exactly as hers always did, and she didn't waste any time making that clear. She walked into our living room on that first visit and immediately pointed out the curtains. They were simple, neutral-colored curtains I had picked because I liked the way they softened the light in the evenings. She frowned and said they were bad luck, and insisted we replace them with the heavy patterned ones she used in her own home. I tried to laugh it off, but Daniel only sighed and told me to just let her have it, that it wasn't worth a fight. The kitchen was no safer. I had always been excited to experiment with recipes and cook meals that Daniel and I both enjoyed. But Margaret had an opinion about everything. If I used olive oil instead of lard, she claimed the food had no soul. When I served meals all at once so everyone could eat together, she reminded me that in their family, the wife serves her husband first. Every time I placed food on the table, I felt her eyes on me, waiting to pounce on something she could label as wrong. She didn't just critique what I cooked, she dismissed it outright. If I prepared pasta the way I liked it, she would push her plate away and say it gave her indigestion. If I baked a cake with fresh fruit, she would claim it wasn't as good as the family recipe she used. It wasn't enough for her to have her own preferences. She wanted me to abandon mine entirely. It went beyond food too. She mocked me for using the dishwasher, saying proper wives wash dishes by hand because it showed real care for the family. She made little digs about the way I folded laundry or how I arranged furniture. Every detail of our house seemed to be up for debate, but always with her winning the argument because she hid it under the word tradition. She would repeat phrases like, "In our family, this is how it's done," as if I was some outsider barging into a club I didn't belong to. Daniel tried to smooth things over whenever the tension rose. He would put his hand on my arm and quietly say, "It's not worth a fight, just let her have her traditions." But every time I gave in, Margaret pushed a little further, testing how much control she could gain in our home. I started dreading Sunday dinners, which were supposed to be a chance for family bonding. Instead, they became a stage for her criticisms. What made it worse was that she never aimed her comments in private. Everything was done in front of Daniel's siblings and extended relatives. If I set the table differently or used the wrong serving bowl, she would call it out for everyone to hear. It painted me as rebellious, like I was intentionally disrespecting the family. And because she was so calm when she did it, it made me look defensive if I tried to explain myself. The longer it went on, the more suffocating it felt. I couldn't even decorate our own living room without a battle. I had chosen light curtains because they brightened the room, but Margaret insisted they were unlucky and pressured Daniel until he caved. Suddenly, my decisions for our home weren't my own anymore. It was like living under someone else's roof, even though it was supposed to be ours. One Sunday evening, after another exhausting dinner of critiques and dismissals, Margaret looked directly at me and said, "A woman who doesn't respect tradition is unfit to run a home." Her words were so blunt, it felt like a line had been crossed. For the first time, she wasn't just criticizing my choices, she was questioning my role as a wife. I didn't argue with her. I didn't yell or storm off. Instead, I started writing things down. Every little tradition she threw at me, I made a note of it. Husband served first. Women clear the plates. Family recipes only. No dishwasher. No modern fabrics for curtains. All of it. I filled a notebook quietly, without letting her know. At first, it was just a way to keep myself from exploding. If I wrote it down, it felt like I was doing something instead of standing there and taking it. But as the list grew, an idea began forming. If Margaret valued these traditions so highly, then I would follow every single one of them, exactly as she said. No bending, no compromising. If she wanted a world ruled by rules, then I would give her that world, and I would make sure she saw how ridiculous it was. I waited for the right moment. It had to be when the whole family was there, when Margaret would expect to shine as the matriarch. That was when I would put her own words to the test, in front of everyone, with no room for excuses. From that night forward, I stopped dreading Sunday dinners. Instead, I started preparing for them in a different way. Every recipe, every seating arrangement, every tradition she valued, I had them ready to go. The stage was set, and I knew the next dinner would be the beginning of a game. Margaret didn't realize she was about to play. The notebook where I had written Margaret's rules became my guide. Page after page was filled with little details she had thrown at me over the months. Things she repeated so often it was like she believed they were carved into stone. Meals had to be served a certain way. Curtains had to hang in certain colors. Men sat first at the table, women last. Plates cleared by wives while the men relaxed. I even wrote down the exact phrasing she used, so there would be no mistake. The first test came sooner than I expected. A small dinner was planned with just Daniel, his mother, and me. I cooked a simple meal, nothing elaborate, but I made sure to follow the seating and serving rules she drilled into me. Daniel's plate went down first. Margaret's eyes lit up at that small victory, a faint smile tugging at her lips. But then I turned and served Daniel's plate, then carefully moved to prepare small portions for children even though none were present, making it clear that the order mattered. When Margaret reached for hers, I held back politely and explained that the rule she had given me was husband first, children second, then guests, and wives last. The words slipped out smoothly, with the same kind of cheer she often used when correcting me. The table grew quiet for a moment. Daniel glanced between us, unsure if this was a joke or not. Margaret forced a smile, but her face tightened as if the taste of her own medicine was sour. She ate, though, and said nothing. That was when I knew this plan could work. I leaned in further as the days went on. Every dish I made was washed by hand, no matter how many plates stacked up. Daniel once tried to help, drying a few with a towel, but I reminded him sweetly that tradition said the wife did this alone. He let go of the towel, uneasy but unwilling to challenge me in front of his mother. Margaret noticed, her lips pursing, but she couldn't argue without contradicting herself. I pulled out the iron next. One night, after dinner, I took Daniel's shirts from the closet and began pressing them late into the evening. Margaret had once bragged that a proper wife pressed her husband's clothes daily, so I did exactly that. Daniel walked into the living room and saw me bent over the ironing board, the pile stacked high. He didn't say anything, but his eyes told me he was worried. Margaret, however, only muttered something about me being too eager. Meals became an exercise in patience. Margaret had always made a fuss about real cooking, so I followed her recipes word for word. If she wrote lard, I used lard, even though I preferred olive oil. If her instructions said to simmer for 2 hours, I set a timer and let it simmer. When dishes reached the table, I made sure to mention the recipe source so everyone understood this was Margaret's way. Her siblings and cousins found it amusing, making little comments that I was becoming a reflection of her. Margaret, on the other hand, began shifting uncomfortably in her chair. At one Sunday dinner, the cracks started to show. Margaret brought a pie for dessert, something she had picked up from the bakery on her way over. As she set it down, I smiled brightly and asked which family recipe it came from. The room went quiet, the relatives watching for her response. Margaret's cheeks flushed, and she snapped that not every meal had to be a history lesson. I tilted my head, confused, and said that I only thought we were supposed to follow tradition exactly. A few cousins chuckled. Margaret excused herself to the kitchen for a long moment before returning, clearly irritated. The hypocrisy was becoming harder for her to hide. Relatives noticed the contrast between her strict rules and her shortcuts. More than once, I caught them exchanging looks or quietly laughing when Margaret tried to correct me, only for me to remind her that I was following her own instructions. Even Daniel's siblings started teasing her lightly, calling me her mirror image. As the weeks went by, Margaret grew restless. She had spent years as the unquestioned authority, and now her words were coming back to trap her. Each tradition she had weaponized against me was now a chain wrapped around her own hands, and she couldn't cut herself free without admitting she had been unfair. The tension built until it was impossible to ignore. Margaret started accusing me of being too literal, but I kept my voice even and calm, saying that I only wanted to show respect for her family's ways. The more I leaned into the rules, the more ridiculous they appeared when held up against modern life. Everyone could see it, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. The next Sunday dinner was going to be larger than usual. Extended family from out of town were expected, people who hadn't seen the back and forth unfold yet. It was the perfect stage. I decided then that I would go all in. I would catalog every detail and enforce every single rule, no matter how small or inconvenient. Seating would follow her exact order, portions divided just as she once described, recipes copied word for word, cleanup handled with no shortcuts. I spent the week preparing for it. I pulled out Margaret's old recipe cards, written in faded ink, and gathered ingredients she hadn't touched in years. I reorganized the dining room so the head seat was prominent, the rest of the table arranged according to the hierarchy she had once lectured me about. I even dug out an old lace tablecloth that had been passed down from Daniel's grandmother, setting it in the center as a finishing touch. The plan wasn't about anger anymore. It was about exposure. Margaret had built her authority on the idea that tradition could not be questioned. By following her words to the letter, I would show everyone that the tradition she clung to was not sacred, it was selective, bent to her convenience. As I folded the napkins into neat triangles and polished the silverware by hand, I imagined her face when she realized there was no escape. Every guest would see the double standard, every rule would be played out in front of them, and Margaret would have no place to hide. That Sunday when the family gathered again, I would be ready. The entire week was spent in preparation. I laid out Margaret's old recipe cards across the counter and picked through the ones she bragged about the most, the ones she had used to remind me how a real wife cooked. I shopped for every ingredient, even the ones she hadn't used herself in years. I pulled out heavy serving bowls, polished silverware, and dug through storage to find lace runners and stiff napkins that matched the tone she always claimed was proper. I even wrote place cards by hand, each one carefully arranged for the traditional seating order she once lectured me about. Daniel watched me from the doorway as I mapped out the table. His name card was placed at the head, followed by spaces for the children near him. Then the men spread along the middle, while the women were tucked at the far end. I adjusted the spacing until the hierarchy was clear to anyone who sat down. By Sunday afternoon, the house smelled like a feast. Pots simmered on the stove, the oven glowed with roasts, and trays of vegetables were lined up. Every detail had been taken from Margaret's rules. When relatives began arriving, they stepped into the dining room and immediately noticed the setup. Some commented on how much effort must have gone into arranging it all. Margaret walked in last, her face glowing, pearls around her neck soaking in what she thought was a tribute to her influence. Everyone took their seats once I guided them to the places I had already marked. Margaret tried to slide closer to Daniel, but I gently redirected her to her proper spot toward the end. Her smile faltered, but she didn't argue in front of everyone. Daniel sat stiffly at the head, clearly uneasy but silent. When the food was ready, I carried out the platters in order. Daniel's plate was served first, with deliberate care. Then the children received theirs, followed by the guests. I moved down the table until I placed plates in front of the women, saving myself and Margaret for last. When I finally set hers down, the choicest cuts had already been served. She picked at what was left, her irritation visible in the tightness of her jaw. I reminded her brightly that this was the order she had taught me, and that I wouldn't want to disrespect family tradition. The table grew tense. Some guests exchanged glances, understanding what was happening without needing an explanation. Still, the meal continued. Dish after dish was placed on the table, each one a careful recreation of recipes Margaret had boasted about. A slow-cooked roast with lard instead of oil, a heavy stew filled with root vegetables, even desserts she hadn't bothered to make in years. Daniel's uncle complimented the spread, saying it was rare to see someone honor the family heritage so completely. Margaret shifted in her chair, her hands tight around her fork. She tried to change the narrative, murmuring that traditions could be flexible, but I kept moving, smiling, and presenting each dish with an explanation of how I followed her guidance to the letter. Relatives nodded, some amused, others watching Margaret closely to see how she would handle it. When the meal ended, I immediately stood and began clearing plates. Daniel moved to help, but I lightly blocked him and reminded everyone that the tradition was for the wife to handle the cleaning while the men stayed seated. He sat back slowly, uneasy but unwilling to break the scene in front of his family. Margaret watched with a strange mix of pride and discomfort, her own role now making me the center of attention. The sink filled quickly, and I scrubbed each plate by hand, leaving the dishwasher closed and untouched. I smiled whenever someone offered to help and explained that it wouldn't be respectful to break tradition. It took nearly half an hour to finish while the men lingered in the living room, chatting and drinking coffee. The relatives saw every second of it, the strain of it clear, but I never broke pace. When dessert time came, I set the table again and invited Margaret to join me in the kitchen. She returned carrying a plastic container filled with store-bought cookies, setting them on the table as if it were nothing unusual. I looked at the package and then asked her, with a sweet tone, which family recipe the cookies came from. The room went silent. Some cousins stifled laughter, others glanced down at their plates to hide their grins. Margaret's face flushed as she tried to explain, but the damage was done. Laughter broke out in small pockets. Someone whispered a joke about traditions not applying to plastic-wrapped desserts. Margaret's eyes darted across the table, her authority slipping with every chuckle. She tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but the tension hung heavy. By the time the last guest left, Margaret's mood was sour. She forced polite goodbyes but avoided looking directly at me. Daniel stood awkwardly near the door, saying farewell to relatives who left still amused by the evening's spectacle. The stage had shifted. For the first time, Margaret's grip on the family's traditions wasn't unquestioned. Everyone had seen the inconsistency, the way she bent the rules for herself while expecting others to live under them. And I knew this was only the beginning. Her facade had begun to unravel, and there was no way she could stitch it back together without admitting that the very rules she enforced were impossible to follow without making a mockery of themselves. I wiped down the counters after everyone was gone, stacking leftovers into containers. The tablecloth was folded and placed away, silverware polished again before being tucked back into drawers. Daniel watched me, silent, his expression heavy with the realization of what had just happened. The night had ended, but the battle was far from over. Margaret had been exposed, and though she would never admit it, she knew it too. All I had to do was keep following the path I had started. One dinner at a time, one rule at a time, until there was nothing left of her control except the fragments she couldn't piece back together. The week after the dinner where Margaret's store-bought cookies had drawn whispers and stifled laughter, I planned something different. Instead of the usual Sunday dinner, I set up a brunch at our house. It gave me an excuse to bring the family back together quickly, before the last evening's tension had time to fade. I leaned harder into the rules this time, determined to show every detail of her traditions in broad daylight. I started with the clothes. Margaret had once made a point about how a proper wife always wore modest dresses during family gatherings. So I found an old-fashioned dress in the back of my closet, high-necked with stiff fabric, and pinned my hair in a simple bun. The outfit looked like something out of an old photograph. When the guests began arriving, Daniel's cousins noticed immediately. They whispered and chuckled, nudging each other, one of them even joking that I looked like I had stepped out of the 1950s. Margaret walked in later, smiling wide as though she expected praise. She looked me up and down, and for a moment her smile faltered before she put it back on again. She complimented the outfit in front of everyone, but the tightness in her voice gave away her irritation. She hated being mirrored so literally. The table was already arranged when people sat down. This time I moved the chairs myself, so there was no debate. Daniel at the head, children nearby, men spread along the middle, women pushed to the far side. Margaret tried to edge closer to Daniel, but her card was clearly marked further down. She sat without protest, though her lips pressed thin. When the food was ready, I carried the trays one by one. The dishes were heavy, but I refused help each time it was offered. I made sure to say that tradition required the wife to serve alone. Some of the relatives exchanged amused looks, watching me balance the platters while repeating the same phrase Margaret had once drilled into me. At one point, Margaret reached for a spoon to serve herself before Daniel's plate had been filled. I gently stopped her hand and reminded her that husband came first, always. The words drew laughter from the cousins at the table, and even one of the uncles grinned. Margaret's face turned red, and she let her hand fall back into her lap. Every detail became exaggerated. Men received larger portions, women smaller. I pulled out heavier glassware for the men, while the women drank from plain cups. I explained each choice out loud, citing Margaret's rules as I went. Daniel leaned toward me once and asked me quietly to ease up, but I only reminded him that I was following his mother's words exactly. He sat back without another word. Margaret tried to regain control by commenting on the seasoning of one of the dishes, wrinkling her nose slightly. Before she could finish, I cut her off by pointing out that family recipes were not to be questioned. The cousins broke into laughter at the table, and someone muttered that it looked like Margaret had created a monster with all her rules. She grew visibly embarrassed, her cheeks bright red, but she couldn't argue without admitting that the traditions she held over me weren't as sacred as she claimed. The rest of the meal carried the same energy. Every time Margaret shifted in her seat, she seemed more uncomfortable. The guests, however, were entertained. They teased her gently, joking about the rules being stricter than they had ever remembered. Margaret kept her eyes down, pushing food around on her plate while the jokes rolled over her. When the last bite was finished, I stood immediately and began clearing the plates. I made a point of refusing any help, reminding everyone that tradition called for the wife to do this alone. The men stayed in their seats, sipping coffee and talking while I carried stacks of dishes to the sink. The pile was tall, the water steaming, and it took nearly an hour of scrubbing before the last dish was rinsed and dried. Every time I passed through the dining room with another stack, I caught relatives watching. Some smirked, some whispered, and a few shook their heads as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Margaret sat stiffly in her chair, silent, while her own rules played out in front of her. Daniel watched me as well. He sat near the end of the table, his hands folded, his eyes following each trip I made to the sink. He didn't step in, but his face showed a weariness he hadn't displayed before. It was clear he was starting to see the absurdity when the weight of all the rules was carried out in front of him. When the kitchen was finally clean, I returned with a tray of coffee and simple pastries. The relatives gathered their coats and bags, thanking me as they prepared to leave. At the door, one of Daniel's aunts leaned close to him and whispered. I didn't catch every word, but I heard enough that his wife was making a point, and that his mother didn't like being exposed. Margaret left last, her expression tight and unreadable. She gave curt goodbyes, avoiding my eyes as she stepped out the door. The brunch had ended, but the tension was still thick in the air. Relatives walked to their cars, still chuckling about the rules, carrying the memory of what they had witnessed. The shift had grown stronger. The more I mirrored Margaret's traditions, the more hollow they became in the eyes of the family. What she had once used as her weapon now backfired in public, her own relatives turning the spotlight onto her. The stage was being set piece by piece. Each brunch, each dinner, each detail pulled another thread loose, and Margaret's carefully built image of control was starting to unravel where everyone could see it. Midweek, I was shopping for groceries when Margaret appeared at the end of the aisle. She didn't waste a moment. She walked straight over, blocking my cart, her voice sharp as she accused me of mocking the family and making a fool of her. A couple of shoppers nearby slowed down, pretending to check labels while clearly listening. I kept my voice calm, explaining that everything I'd done was only in respect for the traditions she had taught me. Margaret raised her voice, saying traditions could evolve and didn't need to be taken so literally. I reminded her gently that not long ago she had called them sacred and unchangeable. The words slipped out smoothly, echoing the way she had spoken to me so many times. Her face tightened. She stammered for a moment, then turned and stormed down the aisle, leaving her basket behind. The other shoppers looked at me with wide eyes, one even smirking before shaking their head and walking off. That encounter set the stage for Sunday. This time, instead of planning every dish myself, I told the family that Margaret had always said traditions worked best when everyone honored them. I asked each guest to bring something made the traditional way. Daniel's cousins jumped at the idea, finding old family recipe cards or calling their parents for instructions. By the end of the week, messages were going around about who was making what. Bread baked from scratch, stews slow-cooked overnight, even desserts prepared the way their grandparents once made them. Everyone seemed amused, treating it like a theme night. When Sunday arrived, the table filled quickly. Cousins and uncles arrived with steaming pots and trays wrapped in foil, setting them down with pride. The dining room smelled like a feast from decades ago. Then Margaret walked in holding a plastic takeout bag. She placed it on the table, and the sight of the bright red pasta container stood out against the spread of homemade dishes. Conversations faltered as eyes flicked between the rustic meals and Margaret's shiny container. I clapped my hands together, smiling wide, and thanked everyone for respecting tradition so well. I praised the bread, the stew, the roasted chicken, naming each one in turn. Then I looked down at the pasta and asked brightly which family recipe it came from. The room fell silent. Margaret's face went pink, then deep red. She muttered something about not having enough time, but it was too late. The silence broke when one of Daniel's cousins snorted and asked if the recipe came from the restaurant menu. Laughter followed, rolling down the table until even some of the uncles chuckled. Margaret snapped at them, saying she didn't have to explain herself. The laughter only grew. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but I noticed his eyes fixed on his mother, watching every word. The meal went on, but Margaret's mood had soured. She picked at her pasta while everyone else dug into the homemade spread. Daniel's uncle raised his glass to me, saying it was good to see the younger generation carrying on traditions. That comment only added to Margaret's discomfort. As the evening continued, she tried to regain footing by accusing me of setting her up. She said I had humiliated her on purpose. Before I could answer, one of the cousins cut in, saying that all I had done was repeat what she herself always demanded. Others nodded, some even saying it was refreshing to see the rules followed by everyone instead of just talked about. Margaret's face burned brighter, her jaw clenched. She pushed her chair back abruptly, the legs scraping loud against the floor, and announced that she felt disrespected. Without waiting for anyone to stop her, she stormed out, her footsteps heavy down the hall. The silence she left behind didn't last long. Conversation bubbled up again, this time openly. Several relatives shook their heads, saying she had always been strict about rules for others but never for herself. Daniel's sister rolled her eyes and said she had grown up with the same double standards, watching their mother enforce rules she didn't bother to follow. The tide in the room had shifted. For the first time, people weren't just laughing at Margaret's behavior, they were calling it out. When the last dish had been cleared and the relatives began leaving, Daniel and I stayed behind in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, quiet at first, then admitted he finally understood what I had been doing. He said he could see now how long his mother had been controlling, not just with me but with the whole family. He looked at the notebook where I had written down Margaret's rules and shook his head, saying he admired the way I had handled it. Later that night, the house quiet, I replayed the evening in my mind. Margaret had left furious, but the relatives hadn't followed her. They stayed, they laughed, they defended me. For the first time, her words hadn't carried the weight they once did. Instead of echoing through the room, they had been met with silence, laughter, and dismissal. The cracks in her control were wide now. She had walked out, but the family hadn't walked with her. That was the moment I knew the balance had shifted. The power she had always held through her traditions was slipping from her hands, and the very rules she once used as her weapon had become the chains that tied her down. Friday evening, just as Daniel and I were getting ready to go out for dinner, there was a knock on the door. Margaret stood on the porch with her coat still buttoned, holding her purse tightly. Without asking, she stepped inside and announced that she expected us to cancel our plans and host her instead. Daniel looked stunned, but before he could argue, I smiled and welcomed her in. If she wanted a visit, she would get one, but it would be under the same rules she had always insisted on. I set the table with Daniel at the head as usual, then began preparing the first course. Margaret sat stiffly, expecting to be served quickly, but I followed the seating order to the letter. Daniel's plate went down first, then the children's settings were filled, then any guest spots we had marked. Margaret waited as I moved around the table, and when I finally placed her plate last, her lips pressed tight. She glanced at Daniel as if expecting him to correct me, but he stayed silent. Before the main dish, I suggested that Margaret contribute something, since tradition made her the keeper of the family recipes. I handed her the old recipe book and asked her to choose one of her favorites. She frowned, flipping through the pages before settling on a baked dish. She moved into the kitchen, and I stayed nearby, offering polite reminders of her own rules. When she tried to adjust the ingredients, I pointed out that she had always said substitutions were disrespectful to the recipe. She sighed but followed through. The dish didn't turn out well. Smoke drifted from the oven when it was pulled out, and the edges were blackened. Margaret tried to scrape it clean, but the burned taste clung to the food. I served it anyway, mentioning cheerfully that tradition demanded we respect the meal as it was written. Daniel's chuckle broke the silence, and for the first time he admitted aloud that his mother had never actually followed her own strict standards. Margaret's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her plate. After dinner, I made the next move. I stood and announced that since Margaret had prepared part of the meal, tradition required her to wash the dishes by hand. The words hung in the air, and she snapped that she hadn't come over to scrub plates. I reminded her, word for word, of her own phrase, "Every proper woman does dishes by hand." Daniel leaned back in his chair, hiding a grin behind his hand. Margaret stomped into the kitchen, grabbing the sponge reluctantly. She began scrubbing while muttering under her breath, her irritation obvious. Just then, the front door opened, and Daniel's sister and two cousins stepped inside. They had decided to drop by after hearing that Margaret was visiting. The timing couldn't have been better. They followed the sound of running water and found Margaret at the sink, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing dishes while I dried them beside her. One of the cousins burst into laughter, clapping his hands together, and teased her with mock praise. "Wow, Aunt Margaret, it's inspiring to see you honoring tradition so faithfully." The others joined in, exchanging knowing glances. Margaret's shoulders stiffened, but she kept her head down, scrubbing harder. The longer they stood there, the more uncomfortable she became. Her face was red, her jaw tight, but she couldn't lash out. If she snapped, she would only prove what the family was already beginning to realize, that she held others to rules she never wanted to follow herself. So she finished the dishes in silence while the relatives chuckled in the doorway. When the last plate was dried and put away, she set down the sponge with force and turned toward the table. The evening ended abruptly. She muttered that her traditions were being twisted against her, grabbed her purse, and left without looking back. The slam of the door echoed through the quiet house. Daniel closed it slowly, then turned to me. He stepped forward, pulled me into his arms, and said softly that he never realized how much I had put up with. He admitted that I had handled it better than he ever could. His voice carried something I hadn't heard before: full support. The next morning, word had already spread. Relatives called to tell me they admired my patience and cleverness. They joked that I had become the real backbone of the household, someone who could stand firm without raising her voice. Margaret's authority was slipping, and the family no longer looked at her as the one holding traditions together. But I knew it wasn't finished yet. Margaret still believed she could hold control if she found the right moment to regain it. The only way to truly dismantle her influence was to go bigger than ever before. A single brunch or dinner wasn't enough. This time I would plan a full showcase, a heritage banquet where every tradition she had forced upon me would be displayed. There would be no room for her to excuse herself, no space to bend the rules. The plan began forming that very night. Every recipe, every detail of the seating, every rule about who served and who cleaned, it would all be woven together into one elaborate evening. The family would see it all at once, and Margaret would be trapped by her own words with nowhere left to turn. I spent the entire week planning what I called the heritage banquet. Invitations went out to nearly every branch of Daniel's extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, even a few people Margaret hadn't seen in years. I framed it as a special night to honor family traditions, the kind Margaret always bragged about. Refusing to come would have made her look like a hypocrite, so she agreed immediately. I dug into Margaret's old recipe cards, some so faded the ink barely showed. I recreated dishes she used to boast about but hadn't bothered with in decades. I tracked down special ingredients she never used anymore. Every dish was authentic to the last detail. The decor was just as deliberate. I pulled out lace doilies, stiff floral table runners, and heavy candle holders that didn't match. It looked dated and overdone, exactly the way Margaret had once declared a proper table should be set. I layered it all together until the house looked like it was frozen in a photo from the 1960s. By Sunday afternoon, the place was buzzing. Guests arrived in waves, slipping off coats and gathering in the living room. They whispered to each other, curious after weeks of hearing about the dinners where I enforced Margaret's traditions. Some already smirked knowingly, sensing the night would be something worth remembering. The front door opened, and Margaret walked in like she owned the room. Pearls around her neck, hair sprayed stiff, chin held high. She smiled as if this was a tribute in her honor, as though all of this effort had been done for her. She took a step toward the table, clearly expecting to be placed in her usual seat of importance. I greeted her warmly but stopped her just before she pulled out a chair. I reminded her that tradition required the matriarch to be seated last. She froze, her smile faltering for just a second before she composed herself. A few relatives caught it and exchanged quiet grins. When it was time to sit, she drifted toward the head of the table as usual, but I guided her gently to the far end, where the least prominent chair had been set. The head spots were already filled by Daniel and his uncles. Margaret's face twitched as she lowered herself into the seat, her pearls glinting under the light while her pride dimmed. Serving began. I carried plates from the kitchen, setting Daniel's down first, then the children's, then the senior men. I worked carefully through the order Margaret had always declared sacred. By the time I reached her end, the choicest cuts of meat and the freshest sides had already been served. What she received looked fine, but hardly special. She glanced down at her plate, then across at Daniel's, but didn't say a word. The murmurs started almost immediately. A cousin leaned forward, speaking just loud enough for everyone to hear, asking if this was how Aunt Margaret always did it. He added with mock innocence that it must have been a lot of work to keep it so strict. Nervous laughter rippled across the table. Margaret's hand slammed lightly against her fork. She snapped that tradition was never meant to be this rigid. The room went silent. I smiled softly and reminded her that she once said a woman unfit to keep tradition was unfit to run a home. Forks paused in midair. The silence grew heavier. Dinner pressed on, but the shift had already happened. When it came time for dessert, I brought out Margaret's signature pie, made exactly as she had once described it. I set the knife in her hand and explained that tradition required the keeper of recipes to serve dessert. She fumbled, the knife wobbling against the crust as her irritation grew. This time, relatives didn't hide their amusement. They laughed openly, asking if these rules didn't apply to her the way they did to everyone else. One aunt even joked that maybe Margaret was exempt because she had written the rules herself. Margaret's jaw tightened. Daniel stood then, pushing his chair back with a quiet scrape. He looked directly at his mother and spoke firmly so no one could mistake his meaning. He said that I had followed her traditions more faithfully than she ever had, but this was our home, and from now on he and I would decide what traditions mattered here. Margaret's face went red. She slammed her napkin down onto the table, the silverware clinking from the force. She accused me of turning the family against her, her voice sharp and loud. But no one came to her defense. Some relatives shook their heads, others avoided her eyes completely. The silence from her side was louder than her outburst. She stood abruptly, chair scraping back against the floor, and stormed out of the house. The door rattled behind her as it slammed shut. For the first time, no one followed her. People stayed where they were, forks clinking softly again as they dug back into dessert. Then the conversation picked back up, but it had shifted. Now the talk was filled with laughter and quiet praise. They admired how calmly I had handled things, how I managed to turn her own rules around without raising my voice. Later that night, after the last guest left and the dishes were put away, Daniel took my hands. He told me clearly that it was our house, our way, from now on. No more rules forced on us, no more bending just to keep the peace. For the first time, the weight of Margaret's control was gone.